Will had never intended to become anyone's anchor. When Dylan first entered his life, she was not a symbol of romance or destiny, but of responsibility that arrived quietly and refused to be ignored. She came with exhaustion in her eyes and a fragility she tried desperately to disguise as independence. Helping her had felt instinctive rather than noble. Will told himself he was only doing what any decent person would do, offering shelter, patience, and a sense of stability to someone who had lost nearly everything. Yet care, once given consistently, has a way of reshaping intention. Dylan did not simply recover under his protection. She began to orient herself around it, and around him. Gratitude softened into trust, trust into attachment, and attachment into a love she never planned but could no longer deny. For Will, life at that moment seemed improbably balanced. His relationship with Electra had unfolded with an ease he had never known before, marked by laughter that felt unforced and a tenderness that grew stronger through consistency rather than intensity. They were admired not because they were dramatic but because they appeared solid. Electra believed in Will's goodness with an almost dangerous faith, trusting not only what he said but who he was when no one was watching. Being with her made Will feel seen in the best possible light, as though her love affirmed the version of himself he wanted to become. Their romance was not without flaws, but it carried a promise of endurance that neither of them questioned. The return of RJ to Los Angeles subtly disrupted that sense of certainty. His presence reintroduced an energy that had been absent, a reminder of histories unfinished and emotions unresolved. RJ's interest in Electra was not overt, but it was unmistakable in the way he listened too closely and lingered too long. Electra noticed it, though she tried to dismiss it as harmless attention. She loved Will and believed that love was enough to insulate her from distraction. Yet attraction is rarely polite, and RJ's interest planted a seed of awareness that would later grow under far more painful circumstances. The night everything shifted was unremarkable in appearance, stripped of the dramatic signals people later expect to see in moments of irreversible change. Will had felt alone in a way that surprised him, despite being surrounded by relationships that demanded his presence. The weight of expectation pressed heavily against him, the pressure to be dependable, strong, and morally consistent, leaving little room for vulnerability. Dylan noticed that fracture before anyone else did. She offered comfort not as a calculated gesture, but as a natural extension of the bond she believed they shared. In that quiet space, boundaries blurred not because either intended betrayal, but because both were reaching for solace without fully understanding the cost. What happened between them was brief, unplanned, and immediately complicated by regret. Will understood almost instantly that he had crossed a line he could never redraw. Dylan, by contrast, experienced the moment as confirmation of something she had long suspected but never dared to hope for. Their interpretations diverged sharply even as the memory remained shared, setting the stage for the pain that followed. Will tried to bury the incident beneath routine and silence, clinging to the belief that mistakes could be isolated if left unspoken. Dylan carried it differently, holding on to the intimacy as proof that she mattered in ways that transcended circumstance. Weeks later, the truth announced itself with brutal simplicity. Dylan's pregnancy shattered the fragile equilibrium Will had constructed around his life. Shock came first, followed by denial, and then a wave of responsibility so heavy it nearly crushed him. The child growing inside her was undeniable, a living consequence of a moment he had tried desperately to forget. News spread quickly, as such truths always do, transforming private failure into public reckoning. Will's identity shifted overnight, no longer defined solely by love or ambition, but by impending fatherhood that demanded clarity where there was only confusion. Electra's devastation was immediate and total. The revelation did not wound her slowly. It struck with the force of betrayal magnified by disbelief. She had trusted Will completely, had built her sense of safety on the assumption that honesty was the foundation of their bond. Learning the truth forced her to confront not only his infidelity, but the realization that the life she envisioned had been constructed on fragile ground. Her anger was sharp, but beneath it lay grief for a future she could no longer recognize. Ending the relationship felt less like a choice than a necessity, an act of self-preservation in the face of emotional collapse. RJ became her refuge almost by accident. He offered no grand promises, only presence and understanding unburdened by shared history. In her vulnerability, Electra found comfort in his attentiveness, and comfort quickly evolved into something more complex. Their connection intensified not because it was uncomplicated, but because it was forged in the aftermath of heartbreak. Each moment they shared carried the weight of transition, blurring the line between healing and replacement. Electra struggled with guilt even as she leaned into the relief RJ provided, torn between loyalty to what had been and the undeniable pull of what was becoming. Meanwhile, Will faced a reckoning that extended beyond romantic loss. Fatherhood loomed not as an abstract idea, but as an imminent reality that demanded sacrifice and maturity he was not certain he possessed. Dylan's pregnancy bound them together in ways that defied emotion, forcing Will to confront the consequences of his actions without the comfort of resolution. He oscillated between remorse and resolve, determined to do right by the child even as he mourned the life he had lost with Electra. Responsibility reshaped his priorities, leaving little room for self-pity but plenty for regret. The relationships between the four of them became a tangled web of longing, obligation, and resentment. Dylan's love for Will deepened alongside her fear of being resented for circumstances she did not choose alone. Electra navigated her growing feelings for RJ with caution, aware that trust once broken is not easily rebuilt, even with someone new. RJ struggled with his own role, caught between empathy and desire, uncertain whether his closeness to Electra was a gift or an intrusion. And Will stood at the center of it all, confronting the reality that good intentions do not absolve harm, and that one moment of weakness can redefine an entire future. As time moved forward, none of them emerged unchanged. Will learned that becoming a father would require him to redefine strength not as control, but as accountability. Electra faced the challenge of opening her heart again without betraying her own sense of worth. Dylan carried both hope and fear into motherhood, aware that love cannot be demanded, only offered. And RJ discovered that connection born of pain demands honesty to survive. Their lives remained intertwined, not by choice but by consequence, bound together by a moment that refused to remain in the past. In the end, the story was not about betrayal alone, nor about redemption fully achieved. It was about the fragile intersection of love and responsibility, about how quickly certainty can dissolve and how painfully growth can arrive. Each of them stood at a crossroads shaped by desire and duty, learning in different ways that the most defining moments are often those we never see coming, and that living with their aftermath requires a courage far greater than the impulse that created them. The closeness between RJ and Electra did not announce itself with drama or defiance. It unfolded quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the shared rhythms of long hours at Forrester Creations, in conversations that lingered after meetings had ended, in glances exchanged across work tables cluttered with fabric swatches and sketches. What began as professional collaboration slowly deepened into something more intimate, shaped by mutual understanding and a shared sense of being overshadowed by expectations neither of them had chosen. They found solace in each other's presence, a calm that contrasted sharply with the pressures surrounding them, and without ever naming it, they allowed that solace to grow into affection. Electra was acutely aware of the danger in that affection. Her relationship with Will Spencer was not casual, nor was it fragile. It was grounded in history, loyalty, and a shared vision of stability that had once felt reassuring. Will loved her openly, confidently, and his certainty had become a kind of anchor in her life. Yet as her connection with RJ intensified, Electra found herself divided between what she had promised and what she was beginning to feel. The guilt settled into her like a persistent ache, one she carried into every interaction with Will, every smile that felt increasingly rehearsed. She told herself that closeness did not equal betrayal, that emotions could exist without action. But the truth pressed closer each day, eroding those justifications. RJ felt the conflict differently, though no less intensely. He was not bound by an existing relationship, but he was bound by history, family, and an unspoken code of loyalty that governed his world. Loving Electra was not simply a matter of desire. It meant stepping into a space already occupied, challenging dynamics that extended far beyond the two of them. He wrestled with the knowledge that pursuing his feelings would not only hurt Will but fracture relationships that had been built over years. Yet restraint became increasingly difficult as Electra's presence grew more central to his emotional life. What unsettled him most was not the risk of exposure, but the fear that silence would eventually cost him the chance to live honestly. Dylan noticed the shift before anyone else did. As Electra's closest friend, she was attuned to subtle changes in tone and behavior that others dismissed. The way Electra's attention sharpened when RJ entered a room, the ease with which their conversations flowed, the shared smiles that lingered just a fraction too long. These details formed a pattern Dylan could not ignore. Her initial suspicion was tempered by loyalty. She wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. But the more she observed, the more unease replaced denial. Dylan's concern was not rooted in jealousy or judgment, but in a protective instinct that urged her to question what Electra herself seemed reluctant to confront. The pressure surrounding RJ and Electra intensified as their feelings deepened. Will's presence loomed large, not as an antagonist but as a reminder of consequences waiting just beyond the edge of desire. Family expectations added another layer of complexity. with unspoken assumptions about who belonged with whom and what paths were considered acceptable. Forrester and Spencer histories intersected in ways that left little room for deviation. And RJ understood that any attempt to make his relationship with Electra public would be met with scrutiny, disappointment, and likely outright opposition. Electra felt that weight acutely, torn between her longing for authenticity and her fear of being seen as disloyal, reckless, or selfish. Secrecy became both refuge and burden. RJ and Electra carved out moments where they could exist without explanation. Brief escapes that allowed them to imagine a version of life unburdened by expectation. Those moments, however, only sharpened the pain of returning to reality. Each goodbye felt heavier than the last, each promise to be careful more hollow. The realization that love alone would not protect them from fallout began to take hold, forcing them to confront a choice they had been postponing. Staying meant suffocation. Leaving meant chaos. The idea of running away emerged not as an act of rebellion, but as a quiet act of survival. They spoke of it hesitantly at first, testing the words as if unsure they were allowed to exist. The thought of a place far from Los Angeles, far from legacy and scrutiny, offered a sense of relief neither had felt in months. It was not about abandoning responsibility, but about reclaiming agency. In those conversations, RJ and Electra imagined a life defined by their own terms, where love did not have to be justified or hidden. The more they imagined it, the more staying behind began to feel impossible. Writing the letter was the hardest part. Every sentence felt like a wound reopened. Every word weighed against the certainty that it would cause pain. They did not accuse or justify. Instead, they explained their need to step away, to find themselves outside the confines of expectation. They wrote of love not as defiance, but as necessity, and of hope not as escape, but as something they needed to pursue honestly. When they finally sealed the envelope, the act felt both final and fragile, as though the paper itself could not bear the weight of what it contained. Morning arrived with a cruel normalcy. Los Angeles moved as it always did, indifferent to the upheaval about to unfold. When the absence of RJ and Electra became apparent, confusion quickly gave way to alarm. Calls went unanswered, messages unread. Panic spread through both families with startling speed, transforming private concern into collective crisis. The letter, once discovered, ignited a storm of emotion that ranged from fear to anger to disbelief. The realization that the two had chosen to leave together reframed everything, forcing each person to confront their own role in the circumstances that led to this moment. Will's reaction was a volatile mix of hurt and determination. Betrayal cut deeply, but it did not eclipse his sense of responsibility. Despite the personal pain, he refused to allow resentment to paralyze him. Dylan, equally shaken, found herself aligned with Will in a way she had not anticipated. Their shared concern for Electra and RJ bridged emotional divides, compelling them to work together despite the tangled history between them. As they searched, they confronted not only the physical absence of the two they cared about, but the emotional distance that had been growing long before the disappearance. Family discussions quickly devolved into arguments, each side searching for someone to blame. Accusations flew, defenses hardened, and long-suppressed tensions surfaced. The disappearance became a mirror reflecting unresolved conflicts, forcing uncomfortable truths into the open. Amid the chaos, a single question lingered unanswered. Had anyone truly listened before it was too late? The search for RJ and Electra continued, fueled by fear, regret, and the desperate hope that love, however complicated, had not led them into irreparable danger. As the city buzzed with speculation and concern, the absence of the two young lovers cast a long shadow. Their choice had shattered the illusion of control their families believed they held, revealing the limits of authority when confronted with the human need for authenticity. Whether their escape would bring freedom or further complication remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that nothing would return to what it had been. Love, once hidden, had forced its way into the open, demanding reckoning from everyone left behind. In the silence that followed the initial panic, reflection set in. Will grappled with the realization that certainty can become blindness when it leaves no room for change. Dylan confronted her own fears about loyalty and truth, questioning whether suspicion ignored becomes complicity. The families, stripped of assumptions, faced the uncomfortable possibility that their expectations had contributed to the very loss they now mourned. And somewhere beyond the city's reach, RJ and Electra carried both hope and guilt into an unknown future. Aware that love chosen freely does not erase consequence, but believing it is still worth the risk, their disappearance was not just an act of escape but a declaration. It spoke of the cost of silence, the danger of postponing truth, and the fragile courage required to choose one's own path. Whether that path would lead to reconciliation or further division remained to be seen. But in leaving, RJ and Electra had forced everyone to confront a reality long avoided. That love constrained by fear eventually demands release. And when it does, it reshapes every life it touches.